So hello, everybody, and welcome back to the policy panel session. Our friend and colleague and first CefES director, Professor Patrizio Tirelli, is participating online due to a very bad bronchitis. It is then my great pleasure to introduce today's panelists, Roberta Torre, Daniel Gros, and Agostino Consolo. Marco Buti could not make it today due to unforeseen commitments at the European Commission, and we are very grateful to Roberta Torre for being with us today in his place. Roberta Torre is a member of the cabinet of the Commissioner for Economy, Paolo Gentiloni. Before joining the cabinet, she worked as an economist in the European Commission's Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs from September 2012 until September 2020. She started as part of a team responsible for country-specific macroeconomic surveillance. In 2016, she joined the Fiscal Policy and Surveillance Unit, dealing with implementing the Stability and Growth Pact and coordinating fiscal surveillance. Before joining the European Commission, she worked at the Economist Intelligence Unit in London and the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock. Daniel Gros is a member of the board and a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies, CefES, in Brussels. He joined CefES in 1986 and was the director of CefES from 2000 to 2020. Prior to joining CefES, Daniel worked at the IMF and the European Commission as an economic advisor to the Delors Committee that developed the plans for the euro. Over the last decades, he has been a member of high-level advisory bodies to the French and Belgian governments. At the highest political level, he has advised numerous central banks and governments, including Greece, the UK, and US. Daniel is currently also an advisor to the European Parliament and was a member of the Advisory Scientific Council of the European Systemic Risk Board until June 2020. He held a Fulbright Fellowship and was a visiting professor at the University of California, Berkeley. In 2020, Daniel holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He has published extensively on international economic affairs, including on issues related to monetary and fiscal policy, exchange rates, and banking. He's the author of several books and the editor of Economie Internationale and International Finance. He has taught at several leading European universities and contributes a globally syndicated column on European economic issues to Project Syndicate. Agostino Consolo has been an economist at ECB for 15 years to date. He started working in the Monetary Policy Directorate at the ECB on non-standard monetary policy measures, particularly on monetary refinancing operation and collateral policy as a response to the global financial crisis. He has then moved to the Directorate of Economics following the euro area sovereign debt crisis to work on the macroeconomic adjustment programs from Greece and Cyprus and forecasting model for the euro area. His research and policy analysis covers the euro area labor market for the monetary policy meetings of the ECB Governing Council. His research interests are macroeconomic modeling, labor market, and monetary policy. His research is published in the Journal of Monetary Economics and the Journal Econometrics. Agostino received his PhD from Bocconi University in 2008. Roberta, Daniel, and Agostino, many thanks again for being with us today. Each of you has 20 to 25 minutes for presentation, followed by a general QA session. And Roberta will talk first, Daniel then, and Agostino last. And Roberta, the floor is yours if you'd like to share your slides.
Sure. Good morning to everyone. I'm trying to share the slides. It says that you cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing. So it seems that you may have.
Let me see whether there is an issue. Okay. Okay, you should be able to share now.
Yes. The group is working. Yeah. Do you see my screen? Do you see the slide?
No, not yet. So it looks like the sharing is paused.
We need it looks fine in the sense that it says you are screen sharing.
Okay, maybe you can start again. I will stop the sharing. Okay, now yes, now we can see your screen. Okay, sorry.
Okay,
Okay,
great.
that's fine.
Good, we managed. Good. So good morning to everybody, and my presentation is gonna focus on the fiscal policy side and on the role of fiscal policy in the current context, given, of course, the economic fallout of the war and the general challenges that our economy is facing. I will focus in particular then on the reform of the EU fiscal rules and how they feature and how they can help to tackle these challenges. So first of all, I would like to give a bit of an overview on what are the challenges that we see for this year, but of course, some of them will be with us for longer. And I think this also ties quite nicely with the previous keynote speech by Professor Spence. So here, we see, let's say, four main challenges, and I'm going to go through each of them, highlighting what are the policy trade-offs that we see for each of these challenges. So first of all, stagflation. So we are facing the risk of a situation of high inflation and low persistent growth. And of course, this raises the policy trade-off of having on the one side the need to support economic activity to avoid a severe downturn, to launch future growth, while at the same time there is, of course, the need to tame inflation, bring it down, and ensure that, of course, inflation expectations remain anchored. Of course, we are also aware that the current situation is very much different compared to that of the 70s and the 80s for several reasons. And of course, the role of energy in our economy, the role of fossil fuels being less prominent than it was back then, much more competitive product and labor markets, as well as, of course, much stronger and solid monetary policy framework. But of course, this is the first immediate challenge that we see. And then when we move to the second, but I would say very much related also to the first, is the risk of financial fragmentation in the markets. We have seen, since basically the start of the normalization of monetary policy, we have seen an increase in the risk premium. And of course, the increase in the risk premium has a greater effect on the most in-depth firms, as well as on the most in-depth sovereigns. And we've seen, of course, that sovereign bond yields have started to increase, but so far the spreads have remained broadly in check. So this brings us to, again, a policy trade-off, because on the one side, we see the importance for monetary policy to normalize and with the full Sudan quantitative tightening. And on the other hand, there is a need to avoid undue widening of the spreads and therefore create turbulences in the financial markets, including sovereign debt. Then we move to the, let's say, third and fourth challenge, which have much, let's say, more structural nature. And here we do have on the third challenge, it's the importance for moving towards economies and society which are more environmentally sustainable, and of course, the importance to sustain the digital transition. These, of course, these challenges were already there even before the COVID, but first the COVID and now the war just has made these needs even more pressing. And of course, here the policy trade-off is very much on the one hand to sustain and support the digital and the green transition, while at the same time also ensure that the social dimension is covered and there is a social sustainability. Because of course we know that if we pursue the green transition, there are certain sectors of the economies that will see unemployment declining, and there's a need for labor force to shift from certain activities to others more sustainable. So of course, it's there is here already one policy trade-off, and then I mean tackling, let's say, both the green and social, green digital and social transition. There is also the importance of pursuing and continue to have prudent fiscal policy and in particular sustainable debt levels. And this, of course, creates a third dimension to these policy trade-offs. Then fourth, it's very much on the competitiveness side, and here the Inflation Reduction Act by the US, of course, features. And here it's very much about, I mean, it's particularly, of course, made stringent by the war. But on the one hand, we see the need for effective national responses in the face of the current energy crisis, while at the same time we need to ensure there's no divergences emerging within the EU and within the internal single market that we have. So again, another tension in our policy response. And as I mentioned, I mean, most, if not all of them, were already present before the war, and the war has just made some, not all of them, even more pressing. So now I shift to how the economic governance review, so our revision of the fiscal rules within the EU, plays a role within this context. So in light of the four challenges. So here we have a rectangle, and if we look at the top part of this rectangle, we do have, of course, on the one side the challenge of stagflation, and the other one on the risk of financial fragmentation. So this side of the rectangle is very much about dealing with and achieving macroeconomic stability. So how does the economic governance review play a role in this? And maybe just let me spend one word on the economic governance review. And it's a revision of the economic governance of the European Union, which, let's say, rely mainly on two legs. The first one is the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, and on which what we would propose are improvements compared to the current current setup of rules. While let's say the most relevant part is very much on the fiscal, where we would envisage a significant, let's say, overhaul of the stability and growth path. So how these can play when it comes to macroeconomic stability? On the one side, we see the importance to pursue prudent fiscal stance, therefore ensuring a good coordination between the monetary and the fiscal policies, and of course also support those investments and those reforms that can relaunch potential growth and therefore help on the supply side, and it once again can help also to coordinate the fiscal with monetary policy action. When it comes to financial fragmentation, a revision of the rules would send a strong signal to markets, to financial markets, that there is a credible set of rules at the EU level, providing therefore a confidence effect that the monetary policy, the fiscal policies of the member states are constrained by a common set of rules and can realistically and plausibly ensure a gradual reduction of the public debt. Then if we look at, let's say, the bottom part of this rectangle, we do have on the one side the green transition, and on the other one, the importance of ensuring and strengthening competitiveness in the EU, also vis-a-vis the challenges posed by the IRA. Then in this respect, the economic governance review, what it does is very much trying to incentivize as much as possible in creating space, fiscal space, for to foster investments that of course can help facilitate the green transition. And on the other hand, of course, I mean, those reforms and investment that are needed for a new EU industrial policy and a new EU business model as well. So overall, I mean, it can tackle as well this, let's say, this side of these two additional challenges that we see. Now, I would like to spend again a word on how the war is posing a significant challenge to our EU economic model. And what we see is that the war, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, has features that make it quite distinct and different from the pandemic. First of all, it has created an asymmetric shock across the world. Here, the geographical proximity of the EU to Ukraine, of course, and its dependency to Russia is creating a much bigger shock to the EU compared to, for instance, to the US. Its effect is not temporary. We've already been seeing significant and important geopolitical shifts following the diversification, for instance, of energy sources, of energy imports. And of course, it has also made the EU energy intensive and export-driven economic model more unsustainable. So we see the war as a, let's say, more existential threat challenge to the EU. And this is why it's important now to reconsider a bit what are the investment needs that the EU is facing at this juncture. We have already done, let's say, an investment need assessment back in 2020 to understand what were the investment needs to transition towards a more green and more digital. But of course, now we need to think again at the situation given this new significant challenge. And this is also why, I mean, as also hinted by the President in her speech, President von der Leyen in her speech at the Davos World Economic Forum, the importance of coming up with the Green Deal industrial plan for Europe, which would be based on, let's say, four main pillars, on adapting the regulatory environment, on facilitating and having a faster access to sufficient funding, improving and strengthening the skills within the EU, and seizing opportunities from the trade perspective. Of course, this is ongoing work, and the Commission will put forward a communication this week on this. But I mean, this is part of the answer, while of course the economic governance review, and again, we go back to the fiscal policy, do play an important role also in answering to the challenges that we see. So now I very much shifted to the fiscal policy angle, and I would like us to spend a word on the current tools and what are, let's say, the main shortcomings that we have identified and that justify changes to the current setup. When it comes to, I go straight to the problems of our current framework, and one of the most cited element is it's the complexity of the fiscal rules at the EU level. We have many indicators. The current tools are based on structural balance, on net expenditure growth. We do have nominal indicators and thresholds, such as, of course, I mean, the treaty-based 3% deficit threshold, the 60% debt to GDP ratio. And of course, we do also have the so-called 1/20 rule, which is the rule imposing a speed reduction of debt down to 60, with an average reduction per year of 1/20, so 5% of the distance between the current debt level and the 60%, which of course, at the current situation where some member states are experiencing very high debt levels and very high budget deficits, attaining and respecting such a rule could even prove self-defeating. So basically brings us to an unrealistic pace of debt reduction, which is embedded in our current set of rules. We have seen also that there has been a procyclical bias in the current set of rules that have not prevented member states to basically run loosening basically fiscal policy in good times and actually tightening and correcting, conducting fiscal adjustments in bad times. Importantly, from the broader perspective and the challenges that we have seen that I've just highlighted in previous slides, the current set of rules have only provided very limited incentives for governments to pursue reforms and investment. So a current set of rules that is very much based on the sustainability side, fiscal sustainability angle, and not enough on the growth dimension. And the last two, let's say, issues that we face very much deal with a lack of ownership on the one side and law enforcement on the other. So lack of ownership, we've seen that the current set of rules is based on common adjustment that doesn't take into account enough the different fiscal positions of the member state, and it is very much centralized and determined at the EU level. And the law enforcement has been made clear by the fact that only half of the member states have attained their MPO, and that the debt-based excessive deficit procedure, so our corrective action in when member states do not bring down sufficiently their debt levels, has never been triggered. So now I would now move to what we see as needed when it comes to changing our fiscal framework. And here we have organized it again against the three main principles of our proposals. So the three main principles rely very much on strengthening national ownership, which has to be balanced at the same time by strengthening enforcement at the EU level. So if we give more leeway to member states to determine their own fiscal path, we need to make sure that there is a sufficient and strong enforcement at the EU level. So that is the first block on the right, on the left, and the last block on the right. And then in the center, we do have the principle of simplification. So when it comes to ownership, how do we intend to strengthen the national ownership? And here it's about letting member states put forward medium-term plans that contain the fiscal path for at least, let's say, the next 4 years, as well as the reforms and investments that the member states want to undertake, again, from a medium-term perspective. The fiscal path will, of course, have to comply with common criteria. It has to make sure that debt either stays at prudent levels or it's brought down and it's put on a downward trajectory at the latest by the end of this 4-year period. Of course, and the 3% deficit threshold has to be respected in the plan because we are not going to change the treaty. The member state, and here it's an important element of our framework, can request a longer adjustment, so they can, let's say, distribute their effort over a longer time horizon, provided that they put forward a set of reforms and investment commitments that do respond, that do help, first of all, that sustainability growth, but do also respond to common EU priorities. So here we are not pursuing a golden rule type of approach where we net out investment, but we want to create a positive incentives for member states, a strong positive incentive for member states to undertake those reforms and investments that are key for sustaining the green transition, to sustain competitiveness, to sustain those common EU priorities that are identified. Of course, once the member states submit the plan, it will be assessed and assessed by the Commission, but most importantly, it will have to be endorsed by the Council. And only once endorsed by the Council, it will be binding on the member state. So the good preparation of the plan is about setting, from the fiscal angle, the fiscal trajectory that the member state will attain over the next 4 years. Once this is set, the focus, both from the EU side, but also from the national side, will be not any longer on defining what are the fiscal targets, but how to attain that fiscal targets. So the focus will shift on the composition and on the quality of the public finances, which to us it's an important element of this revised framework. A simplification will come from, so now a shift to the second block, and it's going to come mainly from the fact that we are going to focus our surveillance and the whole system is going to be based on one single indicator. And here what we propose is looking at the expenditure, net primary expenditure developments. Lastly, maybe on enforcement, giving more leeway to member states to set their path, determine their reforms and investment commitments, it also has to be balanced by a stronger enforcement, meaning that if a member state deviates from its own path, their enforcement action from the Commission could then kick in, triggering not only, of course, the deficit-based EDP, which remains unchanged, but also a debt-based EDP for those member states, of course, that deviates from the path and have a debt above 60%. One last important feature, again, which links back to the importance of reforms and investment, is the fact that we would envisage a new tool for the enforcement of those reforms and investments that have allowed the member state for a longer fiscal, a longer adjustment period, meaning also a more lenient fiscal adjustment each year. And that is very much important to, again, I mean, while we want to have also, first and foremost, the positive incentives for reforms and investment, we do also need a negative, let's say, incentive to make sure that the member state abide to those commitments. In terms of timeline, as you may know, we have put forward our orientations along the lines that I've just sketched out last November. There is ongoing discussions with member states on these orientations, and we would aim to come out with the legislative proposals ideally already by the end of March. So following hopefully the European Council of March, provided that again there is a sufficient agreement, also convergence between member states. And of course, I mean, once the Commission has tabled its legislative proposals, then negotiations with the co-legislators will then kick in. So now I'll just draw my conclusions on the basis of the slides that I presented, and as I showed, we see four difficult challenges with the related important policy trade-offs. The war has just made these challenges even more complex, even more important. I would say the war has really made them existential for the EU, and in particular the EU business model, a rethinking of what are the changes that have to be put forward, and the investments where the investments have to be channeled. And the economic governance review can certainly help, because the current set of rules have not been sufficiently effective in steering investment and reforms and in ensuring sustainable public finances. So the importance to come out with a revised framework. A revised framework that should incentivize and shift even more resources towards what we consider EU priorities, notably, for instance, the green and digital transition, but not only, because of course, I mean, we also do have a security issue. So defense spending is coming back as an important element, which of course the economic governance review cannot tackle as a whole. So there is an overall importance to rethink and think more thoroughly about what are European public goods, and the reforms of our fiscal rules can certainly incentivize and allow member states to channel financial resources and public investments towards these European public goods by what we call then by way of aggregation, so pooling national resources together towards a common EU good. But of course, I mean, the next step will be to think and thoroughly about the supply of pure European public goods. And here with pure, we mean not only achieving a good that is beneficial to the full European Union, but also achieving this public good, delivering on this public good by common resources, which of course, I mean, brings us very much close to the topic of the fiscal union. I stop here. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roberta, for your most interesting presentation. And we move on to the next speaker, Daniel Gros. Let me share your.
Okay, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My presentation will be less ambitious. The title, I think, I gave is a bit over-promising. Can I have the?
Yes.
This one.
Just a second, because I haven't started sharing your presentation. I will do it right away.
So basically, what I thought I'd do is to concentrate on one particular issue, namely energy prices. And energy prices have a specific European angle, which I think is interesting. Therefore, I will not talk about the entire inflation reduction problem that we face in Europe. I think Mike Spence already talked about the longer term issues, and you will have a presentation by Moana this afternoon on core and different aspects of core inflation, so everything that is not energy. But let me talk about energy in Europe. And in particular, Europe means gas, and you will see that that has several peculiarities which one needs to take into account if one wants to look also at the headline inflation figures which we have in Europe. Now, the previous speaker just mentioned that we have to accept higher energy prices in Europe, and that could change our business model. Let me just say two things. Gas is, of course, special because of the pipelines, right? And the cost of switching from pipelines to LNG is just very high and involves very long adjustment times. For oil, of course, it's very different. It's very fungible. And I will just talk very briefly about coal, which is a strange special case at this particular juncture. But if you take all these carbon or hydrocarbon energy sources together, I think we still have, let's say, a somewhat higher price level than we had, let's say, way before the war. Although the prices which we have seen right now are actually below those just, if you want, the day or the months before the war, right? The extent to which these prices already incorporated the danger of a war are difficult to say. I leave that open, but the spot prices, and we'll come back to that, are back down. Now, one reason which I submit to you is for permanently higher prices is basically ESG, which has been at least one factor which has depressed investment by the major Western publicly quoted enterprises. You see here statistics from the IEA. You see the blue bar, which is the Western majors, those subject to ESG pressures. And then you see those who are not subject to ESG pressures. China, Russian companies, and the Middle East. And you see that in 2015, the Western majors were basically top, and they were as large as all the others combined. And that has changed. I haven't seen the latest data, but I bet you their part is their percentage is not going up. And the only reason for this difference in behavior, so constancy of expenditure for exploration in, let's say, the less democratic, less ESG friendly countries, and these the Western majors is, I presume, a large part due to the pressure on their shareholders, on their refinancing costs, and the ECB is contributing that pressure by greening its monetary policy. So we have to keep that in mind. That might be one factor behind high energy prices. On the economic impact of the war in general, I'm rather sanguine. I don't see a big deal. We have the loss of exports to Russia, which has been much discussed in this country, but that's a small share of GDP, and they haven't gone to zero. They have gone to 1/2, perhaps the previous level, and part of it is just routed via Turkey, so a lot of it still is happening. In demand terms, this is offset by more military expenditure, so the pure demand impact, I think, for me, is roughly zero, right? On a permanent basis. On oil, as I said, this is very fungible. We have this very strange G7 price cap, which is designed to make oil cheaper for China, our good old friend. And therefore, oil which went to China has to come to us, and that adds a few dollars to the transport costs. But I think that is marginal. Okay, gas is special. Gas is the biggest problem in Europe because after last summer, Russia has not put it to zero, but has, let's say, reduced its gas deliveries by around 80%. And that, of course, has meant that Europe had to hover up all the free LNG around the world, which led to the price jump last year. But we have already seen the spot price has already come back down to levels which are, quote unquote, only 3 times higher than previously, not 10 times higher. So that's big relief, but maybe we'll have to accept higher gas prices for a certain time. But the point I want to make is that this impact is hump-shaped. The longer the gas price stays higher, the more the elasticity of supply will also increase, right? Qatar will not increase its production when you have 6 months high prices, but when they see the next 3 or 4 years, okay, they might open a new gas field. That's what they have done. So I think, and that the more elastic the gas supply is in the medium to long run, you talked about the declining elasticity for manufacturing goods in newly industrialized countries. That might go down, but I think the elasticity of gas supply might actually increase with technological progress. So that's why I'm pretty confident that over the medium to long run, gas prices will come back down. And as I said, the hump shape is because you have very little free supply in the short run. That's the difference between oil and gas. But if you talk about the very long run, then the elasticity of supply is very high. Just on the short term, I think people always forget. It is very easy and cheap to buy to install a regasification. That's why even Germany has been able to do it within 6 months. It's much more expensive to build the terminals which cool the gas down to minus, 180 approximately. And there you need high tech, and that Russia probably won't be able to do on a large scale on its own. So the gas supply from Russia to the rest of the world is going to diminish and remain diminished permanently, right? They cannot reroute it quickly. And that means basically we have to save in Europe and import more LNG. Short run, very expensive, long run, different. And the second point, which is often overlooked, is that the gas market is also, as a second peculiarity, it is integrated between Europe and Asia, because Asia depends on LNG. America is an happy island of excess gas supply, which stays there bottled up by the lack of export facilities. Remember, I said the export facilities are the ones which take time. And I could very well imagine future American presidents saying, let's go slow on the export capacity, because then our domestic price will go up. Imagine if America was really integrated, then US gas prices would be 3 times higher. Gas in the sense of natural gas, right? Not American for petrol, right? But basically, since the higher price hit not just Europe, but also Europe and Asia, it hit a much larger market, and the fall in consumption, or the increase in the savings you needed were percentage-wise much lower if you had them going on in both Europe and Asia. Here you see the co-movement. For those of you who can think in percentage terms, I have exactly the same data here in log terms. So that a vertical difference is the same percentage difference. And you see that what is it, the Viola, what's the EU TTF price was lower than the average price paid by our importers, and then was of course higher last summer. That's because the actual prices paid by an importer are not equal to the TTF price, but they are equal to the contractual prices agreed maybe 10, 20 years ago. So what you read in the newspapers about the spot price is not the average price paid by importers at the border. Politicians very often forget about that. And some of them have actually said, because the spot price doesn't reflect that, we have to close down the spot price stock exchange to avoid this mispricing. Just a very short note here, as I said earlier, on coal, which has increased for a reason which beat me by about the same price. And that's important for something else which will come now, which is that, do I have it here? Okay, I will come back to this a little bit later, namely the link between gas and electricity, which is unique to Europe again. In other parts of the world, in the US, and especially in northern Asia, they have regulated power prices at the retail level. And then if the power generation companies make losses, the government intervenes. And that's why headline inflation has been much lower there in some part. But if you talk about gas, we have, as I said, the spot price, we have wholesale prices also, which vary. And then we have what matters for the ECB, what enters into the HICP. And these are prices which are regulated at the national level. And this I wanted to, let me jump over the wholesale prices. They are regulated at the national level, and they have a very large non-energy component. So I think most people now look at their gas bill or electricity bill, and they discover that the energy part of it is actually difficult to extract from the bills which they get. But it is actually a, let's say, it used to be actually a minor part, and now, of course, it has become an important, but it's still not the entirely dominant part. And let me perhaps give you the result which you have from this factor, that the energy price comprises other elements, and the fact that government intervenes. Here I have given you by country for December, with December data, the total contribution to the HICP from the energy component in the 12 months up to December. So you see that for Italy now has the highest inflation rate. A very large part comes from the blue part, which is electricity. The orange part is gas, and the other ones you cannot see probably. They are solid fuels, which are important in Eastern Europe. That's basically coal. And you see motor fuels, which depend on the exchange rate. And you see that, for example, in Spain, actually, electricity prices have gone down over the last 12 months. So they have contributed negatively to inflation. Why? Because the Spaniards earlier last year introduced a subsidy for natural gas used in electricity production. Completely counterproductive in terms of energy savings, which we need. But of course, the headline inflation rate in Spain goes down. And you see that France also has a rather low component, again, because the blue one is absent in France because they have regulated electricity prices. So morale within Europe, you have very many different national policies, especially concerning electricity and gas, and therefore very many different the ways in which retail energy prices contribute to measured HICP. Here you see the difference between the US and Europe. And you see that in the US, the green, which is what the Americans call gas, which motor fuel, right, is the main component. In Europe, again, the blue and orangey on average across all countries. So Italy versus Spain is in there. Probably you have put together these numbers. You see that still in September it was very much higher in Europe, about 3 times as high. This has changed over time. You see in the US somehow the data for many months last year were not available, but you see that in the US the energy component to the HICP has been shrunk to close to 0. Right, from very high during most of, and here I apologize, it's gray, most of it due to petrol prices, right, which have subsequently come down. So therefore, for the US, basically the energy price inflation is over. For Europe, it's on the way down, or rather, I should have said for the eurozone, under the impact both of declining spot prices, but they come through very slowly, and subsidies, right? So, and that's the difficult part for the ECB. How much of this is subsidies and how much is this related to declining spot prices? But you can see that it is more sticky in Europe than it is in the United States, the energy component. Meaning there's something to come still for the ECB, even if the spot prices have gone down, and that's because of electricity and gas. As I mentioned earlier, in Europe, this is unique. The merit order system which we have links the electricity price to the highest cost marginal fuel, which used to be, which is gas and used to be very cheap. And coal cannot be substituted because, as I showed earlier, it's actually has become as expensive as gas in terms of percentage increases. Plus, it has the carbon pricing component. So that's why for us in Europe, gas is the marginal cost of electricity. Many people have said this is bad for our competitiveness. I think this is exactly what the doctor ordered for last year, because it helped us to reduce energy use. Right? Without that, probably you would have been in a much tighter spot. Here I just show you the terms of trade loss, which also the ECB, your colleagues tend to show. Here at the EU 27 level, you see the latest data here is, of course, just the summer of last year. I think your colleagues have data until the 3rd quarter. Doesn't get much better until then, but now maybe it will come. But why am I showing this? Because if you have a terms of trade loss of 20%, maybe down to 15 soon, and your export or trade to GDP ratios are 20%, you multiply one by the other, this is a 3% loss in terms of national income. And that means you cannot expect a full catch-up of wages. People have to accept some loss of purchasing power. And that's, I think, the question for the ECB. Will people accept it? And basically, how does that might be a question for you, interfere with it, what we take as given the Phillips curve? Does it move it? Does it change its slope? Right? Maybe you will talk about that. But I think this is one of the key issues for the ECB. So my conclusion is simple in a certain sense. The energy component was of paramount importance in Europe last year, much higher than in the United States. There are large differences across EU member countries having to do with national regulations. And the retail prices which go into the HICP will and are slow to reflect the changes of spot prices. That applies both for gas and I would say even more for electricity. And that makes, I think, headline inflation or the energy component of headline inflation difficult to predict. If I look forward into the longer run, as I said, I'm more optimistic about the longer term supply measures, so that if the ECB does, let's say, its real job, which is to check core inflation, then I think we should eventually succeed to coming back down to 2%. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. So we'll just a second that we have to change the presentation.
Okay, I think it's okay. My voice is quite loud. Well, it's okay. So let me start thanking for this invitation and congratulating for the anniversary of the university. I think it's a great achievement. Maybe just to set things right since the beginning, the usual disclaimer: this is not the ECB view, this is the author's view and should not be reported as ECB view. So let's be very clear, as I still want my job back when I go to Frankfurt. Okay, no, jokes apart. So this is a joint work with Simone Lecchiaia, Isabel Vastenquiste. I'm in the economics department, they are in the international department dealing with commodity prices. So this is a joint work putting things on basically energy price shock and looking at the unemployment inflation trade-off, both in the euro area and in the US. I mean, let me start basically showing this data. No? So basically, these are what Daniel calls more spot data, and on the left-hand side. So figure 1 is about basically spot price for oil price. You see the euro area and the US. So there are some just key dates. So December 19 there is actually the average of 18 and 19 were around $60 per barrel, both in the two areas. They go down during the COVID and they move very strongly and they go up together in the exit of the pandemic, even during the Russian war. This is signal basically also the tradability of oil compared to what is not instead happening in the natural gas market, which is the figure on the right-hand chart, which show completely two different segments of prices for the US, which remain rather stable. These are the diamond orange dots. And instead, the euro area market of natural gas completely go skyrocketing in terms of prices. And I mean, this is a key element because what we will try to analyze is to look at basically at the surge in euro area US inflation, especially in the exit from the COVID-19 pandemic, which we think have somehow several and different drivers between the two areas. And there are some common drivers. For instance, the both area features supply bottleneck, especially coming from the global supply chains and the global value chain originating with China lockdown. But they also have some specific elements which are more related to fiscal policy. That's at least a little bit our interpretation, which mostly in the US. While we see a lot of dynamics on the energy prices for inflation being in the euro area. So I think it's what I will be talking today. It's mostly about looking at the energy price, but we should keep in the back of our mind that basically one of the difference between these two areas is not only the energy price component, but it also related to other common factors like supply bottleneck or fiscal policy. And our work really focus on decomposing the energy price or the oil price into factors, right? And we take these two factors from a sort of global type of literature, which says basically there is a global drivers of commodity of oil price or energy prices in general, which includes coal and gas, which we call it a global commodity price shock. This is a shock which moves all the prices of commodities in the same directions. I will show you later how this is computed and is derived. And then there is an energy market specific shock, which resembles a little bit more a supply type of oil shock. And by doing this decomposition, we're able to explain the most of the variation in oil price in this case, or other energy prices. And we will try to see how these two different shocks affect the unemployment inflation trade-off, and whether this is the same across the US and the euro area, and what implication has, for instance, a weakening of this trade-off, because of course this can have implication for the current tightening cycle if the trade-off that the central bank face is weakened, or it can have also implication for long term. I will not be covering this issue today, about the energy transition, and of course thinking of basically moving from to the green economy in a context where the Phillips curve has a different trade-off than we were thinking initially. Okay, let me give you an overview of what we are going to present, just to try to answer about this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So we take a model, a factor model for commodity prices. This includes both energy and non-energy prices, and we're going to derive key factors from these factor models. And what I called before the global factor is we show that there's a key driver of oil price since the early 2000s in the US. This is also happened for the euro area, but I will show a chart on the US. Then we look at a very, very simple US Phillips curve to see how basically these global factors are going to play on the Phillips curve, whether there is a flattening or not. And then I want to look at this price shock from a, I would say, multivariate model. So where we put together not only like inflation, but we see also how unemployment or inflation expectation are going to react in the US and the euro area. And we are going to see whether we can basically get some difference between these two areas to understand the type of trade-off the monetary policy is facing. And then as a bonus point, I will also talk briefly about the natural gas price impact in the euro area. Let me give you a very quick overview of the factor model that we use, which is based on the paper by Delle Chiaie, Ferrari, Giannone from 2021. So for any commodity prices, commodity prices are usually globally traded, and therefore these are defined in global markets. They find that there are three components that basically can explain the large variation, right? So the first component is a common global factor, which moves in the same direction all commodity prices. And therefore, this is easily interpreted as a sort of global demand factor. And then there is a set of M blocks, which are orthogonal to each other. And each one of these blocks determine a market specific, be it the energy market, be it the food market, metal, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have an idiosyncratic component, which is commodity specific. So what we show, and what I will show in a while, is that the idiosyncratic component basically does not matter at all. But as I will show at the end, the idiosyncratic component may actually matter for the gas development, because as you can see, while I can draw a factor model and to explain the dynamic in oil price, which has a strong movement among oil price and gas price, etc., it would be hard to disentangle the difference between natural gas prices between the US and the euro area. So I will basically remain silent on the XI component, which is the idiosyncratic component of oil, gas, etc. But in the last slide, I will come back to that. So we will end up using this factor structure. And this factor structure, for instance, in the case of the energy market, we will have a factor for the energy market, and we will have a sort of Z shock, which basically originate the, I can show the So it's in equation 2, basically. Okay, well, in the equation 2, the zeta component is basically the shock that is, which is specific to the factor, be it the global factor or the energy factor. They are orthogonal and not correlated. So our definition is basically there will be two factors. One which is, as I said, which is FG, common to all commodities, sort of global demand feature, and an energy factor which is instead more as a sector specific, more of a nature of a supply shock. And here what we show is basically, if we look at the historical decomposition of the cumulative change of oil price, for instance, since 2000, basically the large variation of oil price determinants is driven by the blue line, which is the global commodity price factor. What is the global commodity price factor is basically also related to the fact that over this period, with China entering the in the World Economic Organization, basically, and basically in the role of emerging markets in the global economy, most of the growth over this period has been basically generated outside the advanced economy. So there is a role in the global economy, and this role is actually captured by the global demand factor. But of course, there is also there are also elements coming from the energy sector. If you want to see more of this decomposition, I will just ask you to refer to the original paper by De Lecaille et al. But basically, to show that more and more recently, with the China and emerging Asia playing a bigger role in global demand, the global demand factor has been a great pusher of oil price and a basic contribution. Now, if we look at the US Phillips curve, basically there are there is basically this paper by Forbes which says, look, if we start in basically embedding the Phillips curve with a sort of a bunch of variable which can reflect globalization or the inclusion of global value chain or trade intensity, etc., we derive a sort of flattening of the Phillips curve. And therefore, Forbes provide a justification for the flattening of the Phillips curve coming from the intensity of the degree of globalization, I would say, since the mid-2000s. But here in this simple example, which is basically a simple specification following Cobion and Gorincesco, we actually, if we refer to the contribution from oil price, whether it comes from a global demand perspective or global market perspective, then basically we don't find a flattening of the Phillips curve. But actually what we find that is interesting for the US is that this jump around basically, I mean, yeah, this is a recursive regression, but I would say starting from mid-2000, from mid-2000, 2005, 2006, a higher contribution of the commodity price factor. And as I will explain later, we attribute this also to basically both to China and to the extent the energy factor, the energy market contribution, so the lower panel on the left, also to the so-called US shale oil and gas revolution, which has basically changed the parameters and how basically this has affected US inflation. Now, I mean, we want to move away from a Phillips curve specification for one reason, because when we look at the effect of global factor or energy factor, they may have general equilibrium effect on unemployment, for instance, or inflation expectation. So the idea is basically to run a sort of structured Bayesian VR, where considering basically the standard definition where the epsilon shocks are related to the so-called factor shocks. And in order to do that, we follow something which is rather standard in the literature, this sort of proxy Bayesian VR, following Stock and Watson and Merton Raven, where basically we assume that the zeta shock, so the shock that is determined in the global markets, is somehow orthogonal to the other shock in the economy. And by using basically, and this actually, I mean, we also test for weak identification and the usual, I would say, machinery for this. There is strong support for this shock to be, I would say, relevant for our market, for our exercise. Of course, another caveat in order to run and to assume, to verify whether these shocks are actually capturing our oil price shock is to check whether they are relatively exogenous. So we do two things. First, we run our VR in a boundary frequency. Yeah, we follow something that is standard in the commodity price literature, which assume that global commodity prices that are determined at the monthly level, they don't cause basically a macroeconomic variable in the US within the same month. But I also did a robustness check, which basically is taking some factors that explain the US macro variable and take the orthogonal part of this shock, just to clean whatever and it's there, which could come from the US. But basically, so the idea is to look at this data shock, so to look at the shock that affects the global factor, to look at shock that affects the energy factor, and see how CPI, unemployment rate, and inflation expectation are driven. And I will do this for the euro area and for the US. For the euro area, as I explained here, unfortunately, I need to use quarterly data instead of monthly data. That's why our preferred exercise is with the US data. And also for the euro area, simple data and inflation expectation, unfortunately, runs only from 99 or 2002, depending on the type of expectation. Otherwise, the exercise is relatively straightforward. And here I want to show you basically three groups of impulse response function. So here these are the impulse response function to the unemployment rate for the global factor and the energy market factor. And basically a key results, which is somehow was already there, and it's important to be aware, is that of course for both type of shock, inflation goes up in very similar way. But what really matters is the unemployment response. In the global factor shock, because it's a sort of global type of demand shock, this actually reduces unemployment in the domestic economy, while in the energy market shock, it's definitely no negative and tends to be basically, it's positive. So for the euro area, a sort of energy market shock continue to have a trade-off, to pose a trade-off for monetary policy, while it's a completely different story whether we are talking about a global factor shock, which is a factor coming from strong global demand for which the euro area may be affected via export channel and etc. The story is slightly a little bit different for the US unemployment response. While we have the same response for the global factor, we see that over the full sample, also the energy market factor tends to be negative and significantly negative for, I would say, almost a year, but it's basically 8-9 months. And actually, we were surprised about seeing this factor. And basically, what we have done, it was to compute a sort of rolling estimates of this impulse response function to see whether the change in the impact of the energy market was somehow related to the domestic production of US oil and gas shale. And actually, basically, what we show here, basically, we show the impulse response function for the three variable, and this is related to the energy market, and we take the average 6 months impact. And so the average 6 months impact tends basically to wash out a little bit, but if you see the unemployment rate over time, so if we start basically in 78 up to 99, tends to be on average positive, and then over time becomes negative and significant. The turning point is very much related to the US production in oil gas, in US shale and gas and oil. And therefore, we think that this trade-off may be affected by the domestic production of energy. And I think this has basically also, as I will try to corroborate later, may have also implication for the overall trade-off and the energy transition. Because basically what we are saying is that to the extent a country shifts its production towards domestically produced energy, the type of effect after following a price increase may be different. So actually, you can if you add in this model, for instance, industrial production reacts strongly on impact out of this shock, because of course, if you are in the business of producing machinery, etc., so your economy is also affected. There is a paper, for instance, from the IMF, which basically tries to highlight what is the employment effect coming from the employment creation in the US gas and shale oil and gas. And they see that basically over the period 2008, 2014 and 15, a large component of employment creation is exactly focused on those states that are basically a gas or oil producer. While apart from, I think, New York, all the other states in the US negatively contribute to employment over the 2008-2014. So this basically means that if at the same time you are hit by a sort of energy type of shock, your employment may be benefit from the type of shock to the extent you are in that business. So in this basically the main idea of the paper. Of course, there could be also other explanation. For instance, Blanchard and Galli, they have a 2010 paper somehow which doesn't fully capture basically the shale revolution, but which basically said that one of the limited impact of energy shock on unemployment may be better due to better policy. I would say lower wage indexation, or like more wage flexibility, or better monetary policy that they have been able to anchor inflation expectation, etc. I would say, given the type of break that we observed following basically 2009 developments, we think that basically the structure of the shale gas may be also a further explanation, and therefore how this type of energy shock effects may be relevant for the unemployment inflation trade-off. Let me briefly move also to talk a bit about the euro area natural gas prices, because as I said at the beginning, basically each commodity price can be driven by three components: a global, an energy, and a idiosyncratic part. Therefore, also the gas prices, the euro area natural gas prices, could be eventually fully described by global, by energy, and we could rule out the idiosyncratic part. But we know that because it's not fully tradable, the euro area natural gas, because of the relative war, the idiosyncratic part, as I show in the first chart, become relevant. And basically what we do for the euro area, we run with a little bit of uncertainty because we have definitely a shorter sample, but we also run a sort of rolling, so I would say, Bayesian VR, where we see the impact of the idiosyncratic part gas shock. So it's basically the Xi in the gas equation for the factor. And we see, for instance, that by and large, both the HECP, I mean, we see only, I mean, we ran this up to the 2022, right? So up to the latest data, which I think is basically Q3 of 2022. And we see that while it has sort of muted on non-significant effect until that time, in basically 2021, 2022, we see a definitely this gas shock having important implications, not only for HICP in general, but also for inflation expectation. Actually, we were really surprised how inflation expectations somehow moved compared to this type of shock. But here I added also wage inflation, because there is a lot of discussion about whether the second round effects may come via the renegotiation of wages. Just to give you an idea, like for instance, here, I mean, the impact, because this is one standard deviation of this idiosyncratic shock. So you need to multiply, if you want to match the gas price, you need to multiply between 7 and 10 times this impact. So this basically means that you will have sort of 3 percentage points on HICP inflation explained by gas, a very muted response on employment, which actually is something that we currently see, but also a very significant sort of 2 percentage point increase in inflation expectation, and somehow sort of 1 percentage point on wage inflation. The reassuring thing is basically the wage have remain relatively muted, but of course the unsure things is of course that this is a shock that has never happened throughout basically all this sample size, and we only see the spike basically as starting as mid-June 2021. So I mean, let me just conclude. So basically for the short run, basically we look at these two drivers of oil price, the global factor and the energy factor shock, and we see how basically the more muted impact of energy factor shock in the US may have affected the trade-off. Which basically simply means that, for instance, if that were to happen in the US, there were very little trade-off. It was not as a standard oil price shock where the central bank has to ponder out or has to balance out the negative effect on unemployment. There are little negative effect on unemployment coming from a pure energy factor shock. And the global factor shock does not have a trade-off per se. So this is basically in the US, provide some suggestion. In the euro area, we still see a trade-off. So in the euro area, we still see basically negative implication coming to unemployment. Therefore, basically via the Phillips curve, that basically could work in reducing inflation down the path. We have also some further work to do on the missing disinflation, because of course these two drivers of oil price, they have different implications. One works more via the unemployment, the other one works more via inflation expectation. And therefore, for instance, the discussion by Kobion and Goronicescu, where they say that the missing disinflation is an explanation via higher inflation expectation because of oil price, will be there only if this is related to the energy factor shock and not to the global factor shock. This is something that we need to further investigate. And then for the long run, I think a key question, which is related to what we saw in the US in terms of transition to the shale revolution, but it can be also related to the euro area to the extent we do a transition to the green energy production, is basically that by increasing the domestic production of energy type of oil price or energy type of shock will reduce the trade-off, and therefore will make probably central bank life easier, at least to respond to shock. I will stop here. Maybe I have a couple of charts also to reply to Daniel, but I will leave the floor now to the others.
Thank you very much. So we open the floor to questions, and well, I see that there are two questions for Roberta right away. And Roberta, can you read through the chat? Because Patrizio is fully muted due to his bronchitis.
Yes, okay. So I'll read it out loud so everyone can see. So the first question from Patrizio.
Can you just we cannot hear you properly. Probably if you can speak closer to the mic and also the volume a bit.
Is it better now? Can you hear me better?
Yes, it's better. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So the first question from Patrizia, read it out loud. The ability of a single country to follow that reduction plan crucially depends upon general business cycle conditions. In this regard, the global fiscal stance of the Union could play an important role. How is it going to be defined in this new framework? It should not be simply the average of the independent national fiscal strategies. The opacity about the global fiscal stance is a key difference in the macro framework between the EU and the USA. So I start from this question on the overall fiscal stance. So in the new framework, the fiscal stance will continue to play a role as it did in the current one. So on this dimension, it continues to be, I mean, we don't expect to change, let's say, the approach, which is very much based on, first of all, euro area dimension and anchored in our assessment of the fiscal policies that the member state intends to undertake for the following years. So the way we measure the fiscal stance will not be, let's say, affected as a whole, in the sense that it remains a measure of the fiscal impulse. So the change in the budgetary position, basically, of the member states from one year to another. But what it is important and what we have already taken into account for is that now there's also a EU dimension that plays a role in determining the aggregate fiscal stance for the euro area as a whole. So the idea is that the euro area fiscal stance is not simply the combination of the single and each fiscal stance at the national level, but there is also a EU contribution to it. And where does it come from? I mean, it mainly comes from the recovery and resilience facility. So this new tool, this new pot of money that is generated, let's say, at EU level and fits into the fiscal stances of each member state to a different extent, depending on their needs, but do play a role at the aggregate, not just at the national level, but also at the aggregate level. And it tops up, let's say, the fiscal stance of the national level. And of course, I mean, here the idea is very much that we want to keep the focus on the euro area fiscal stance, because we want to ensure a good coordination to the largest extent possible between monetary and the fiscal policies, which of course, I mean, it has therefore then and also an impact at the global level, in the way that we manage shocks and in the way we respond to the challenges. Then I may now move to the second one. The second question from Patrizio: there is an obvious enforcement problem. We can expect disagreements about the country-specific cyclical conditions. Further, could you please be more specific about enforcement mechanism? If I look at the behavior of the current Italian government, I must say that the threat of curtailing funds of the Next Generation EU was very effective in forcing the government to stick to the previous government's commitments. So yeah, okay. When it comes to the enforcement side, indeed, I mean, this is a known, let's say, finding that there is indeed been an enforcement problem. I think the point you raised brings us very much to the idea of which positive incentive or positive incentives we can give to the enforcement. And of course, I mean, in the context of the RRF, the positive incentive is very much there in the sense that we have a stick and we have a carrot. So, and the carrot is clearly there. So if a member state does not deliver on the reforms and investment, we cannot disburse the amount that is supposed to be given to that member state. On the fiscal rules, of course, we miss, let's say, the carrot because we don't have a central fiscal capacity that can play as a deterrent for member states not to deviate, meaning that if they deviate from the fiscal path, if they don't pursue prudent fiscal policy, then they don't have access to such a central fiscal capacity. Of course, we live in a world where this is not there, this element is not there, so we can't really play the same dynamic that we have in the RRF, and therefore we remain, let's say, based on sanctions and negative type of enforcement. But here, what do we do? So how do we want to strengthen still the enforcement with this limitation? Is we want to strengthen it. Well, first of all, I think there is the idea of ownership. I think increasing the ownership, so letting member states determining first their fiscal path, make the governments much more accountable for any deviation that they have with respect to this, to their agreed and their own trajectory. But then, of course, when they deviate, there would still be an enforcement action at the EU level, and we would like to make the opening of excessive deficit procedure, so our corrective action, more easy, because it will be triggered by deviation from the path. So there will be, let's say, less room of discretion from the Commission side, especially where the fiscal risks are higher. So if it is a member state characterized with a significant fiscal risk that deviates, the condition to trigger, there would be a strong presumption that this deviation leads to a gross policy error that can have, of course, spillovers for the EU as a whole, and therefore requires the opening of an EDP. So there would be, let's say, clearer conditions to trigger a debt-based excessive deficit procedure, but there will also be clearer conditions to get out of such a procedure. One of the reasons why we have not been able, let's put it a bit more bluntly, to trigger EDPs is that they have been considered a bit of a nuclear option, especially for the debt, meaning that a member state with a high debt entering an EDP would have been bound to follow a very long adjustment before it could go back respecting the rules and therefore get out of the procedure. Now we want to make it, let's say, easier to trigger an EDP, but also easier to get out of such a procedure, because if a member state goes back, so complies again to its own trajectory, then again, this would be a condition to bring back, the member state from the corrective to the preventive arm of the rules. So deactivate the procedure. Then another dimension that we want to tackle is on the financial sanctions. And we think that one of the reasons that have made, again, the excessive deficit procedure a bit of a nuclear bomb is the fact that we do have financial sanctions of a significant amount. We have experience under other procedure, under other procedures in the EU framework, notably statistical domain, so breaches under the statistical domain regulations would trigger sanctions of a much more negligible amount, and they have been used in the past. So we think that by reducing the financial amounts, so making them more reputational than financially burdensome, could help as well to have this tool at disposal, if, of course, if needed. And maybe one last point is on the reforms and investment perspective, which is the growth dimension, and that the part that we really want to strengthen in this revision. As I said, we would envisage the possibility to have an enforcement tool in this respect, so that if member states don't deliver on their reforms and investment, then their trajectory, so the time length of their plan would be shortened. So we would give ex ante the benefit of the doubt, meaning like if you put forward the commitments that are good, you can have a longer time to make a fiscal adjustment. If you don't deliver, this longer period will be taken back. So we don't give this benefit any longer. So it's, again, it works a bit in the negative, but it provides a bit of a threat to the member states so that they abide to their reforms and investment commitments. And I stop here.
Okay, thank you. So I think, Daniel, would you like to intervene further?
No, but just I had a very short question of understanding. When you say that you add the NGU to the fiscal stance, do you refer to the grant component only? Okay, good.
Yeah, confirm.
Agostino?
Maybe actually I have one question for Roberta, but since Daniel has to reply, I just try to reply to some of his questions. Maybe I don't know whether you can put the slides. I have 3 slides in the annex which can help. But on the first question about the ECB greening, I think, of course, the greening was part of the discussion during the strategy review. There's been a huge emphasis. In the final statement, there was, would say, an emphasis mostly on collateral policy, I mean, in substance. I think recent speech, for instance, Schnabel was clear, no? I think there is, I don't know, probably the benefits of inside information. I see for the monetary policy discussion a bit less of a priority or a trade-off, basically, that coming from greening, right? So that's probably definitely my personal view, but I don't see the same amount of, for instance, of trade-off that comes from concern about, for instance, a risk of recession or like geopolitical risk. So I think, of course, there is a lot of talking. Powell was very explicit, but not being able to be so as explicit as he was. But yeah, I hope we will not do any harm there. I share your concern. So maybe if you go to my presentation, no, not this one, the other one. So I think you have a question. I mean, there are like you have this question about core inflation. So if I may, so I have 2 points which may be of interest. So this is basically a key component of core inflation is service inflation. So here we did a work that basically was used by Philip Lane, but I can also reuse. So basically here we show that a big chunk of the increase in service inflation is related to content and energy intensive sector. which basically means in a short that there's been a sort of complementarity exiting from the pandemic. So exiting from the pandemic, those sectors that have been mostly affected by the pandemic, and they basically had a sort of more vertical, I would say, demands for goods, and in this case for services, and they've been able to pass through basically because they are also energy intensive sector, they've been able to pass through. So this is this could be read as a sort of good news somehow, or but it depends, of course, on whether some of this is related to wages and on the implication. What we have on wages, we recently did something like looking around at the Euro system to collect information on negotiated wages. I don't know whether you saw this information. So until now, we are basically in the order of, on average, let's say 4%. I mean, this is still, I would say, a huge terms of trade shock, and real wages are definitely down. I mean, by I don't know, more than 8%, probably 7%. No, you think? Oh, well, in some countries, but if you think that in general inflation is sort of 10%, no, and wages increased by 3 or 4, then you get 6, no. So basically, I think the key question there is really, and this goes back a little bit to fiscal, is to see how the fiscal is going to play out. And of course, we stopped giving fiscal suggestion after August 2011. But let's, I would say, I mean, I think there is a strong emphasis of pushing for more fiscal pushing for target fiscal intervention, because I mean, untargeted fiscal measure could eventually undo what we are trying to do in terms of basically fighting a strong aggregate demand. So on this aspect, I think, I mean, a sort of monetary fiscal interaction is definitely, or coordination is definitely there, as there was a need somehow to talk to each other and to see basically what was wrong, or how to better fine-tune the euro area business cycle in the previous recession to get out of the euro area sovereign debt crisis. I think also in this context, talking about the role of fiscal policy, not only monetary policy, in tightening the current cycle is also relevant, right? So I will.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are really under time pressure, and I believe we should close here and reconvene this afternoon at 2. And there is now lunch for everybody at first floor. Thank you, Roberta, again for your talk. And
Thanks to you. Have a nice afternoon as well. Bye.